The fog clung to Berlin like a shroud, thick and gray, muffling the clatter of boots on cobblestone and the distant hum of Trabant engines. It was November 1962, and the city was a fractured chessboard, east and west locked in a silent, brutal match. The wall loomed in the distance, a jagged scar of concrete and barbed wire, slicing through lives and loyalties. For Erich Voss, a West German agent embedded in the Bundesnachrichtendienst, or BND, the fog was both ally and enemy. It hid his movements as he slipped through the alleyways near Checkpoint Charlie, but it also cloaked the threats he knew were never far behind. Erich adjusted the collar of his trench coat, the damp chill seeping into his bones. His cover was simple, a low-level clerk in a West Berlin import-export firm, a man of ledgers and manifests. In truth, he was a shadow, a collector of whispers, names, dates, troop movements passed from trembling hands in the east to the analysts in Bonn. Tonight, though, wasn't about routine drops or coded signals scratched into park benches. Tonight was different. He could feel it in the weight of the envelope tucked inside his coat, pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat. He'd retrieved it an hour earlier from a dead drop in a crumbling cemetery near Prenzlauer Berg. The signal had come via a faint chalk mark on a lamppost, a diagonal slash, barely noticeable unless you knew to look. The drop itself was a rusted tin box hidden beneath a loose gravestone, the name H. Muller etched into the marble. Inside, a single sheet of paper, folded tight, its edges brittle from the damp. Erich hadn't opened it there, too risky. The East German Stasi had eyes everywhere, informants in every cafe, microphones in every wall. He'd waited until he was back across the border, ducking into a dimly lit phone booth near the Brandenburg Gate. Now, under the flickering bulb, he slit the envelope with a pocket knife. The message was a cipher, rows of numbers, no words, no context. Erich's pulse quickened. He'd seen ciphers before, but this one was dense, chaotic, lacking the usual patterns of a one-time pad or substitution code. It wasn't meant for field agents like him. It was too complex, too raw. This was meant for the cryptographers, the desk-bound geniuses with their machines and slide rules. So why had it come to him? He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, jotting down the first few lines. 174928333127. The numbers blurred as his mind raced. His contact, an East German defector codenamed Nightingale, had never sent anything like this. Their exchanges were terse, practical. Troop counts along the wall, Stasi patrol schedules. This was something else, something urgent. Nightingale had risked everything to get it to him, which meant Erich had to assume the worst. Exposure, compromise, or worse. The phone booth's glass steamed with his breath as he worked. He flipped through his mental catalog of codes, Vigenère, Enigma variants, even the old Soviet mask systems. Nothing fit. Then, a sound broke his focus. A slow scrape of footsteps outside, deliberate, too close. He froze, slipping the paper back into the envelope and the envelope into his coat. Through the fogged glass, a silhouette emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, a fedora pulled low. Not a drunk, not a civilian. Erich's hand drifted to the Walther PPK holstered under his arm. The figure paused, lit a cigarette, the flare of the match casting a brief glow on a sharp jawline. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the shadow moved on, swallowed by the mist. Erich exhaled, his nerves taut as piano wire. Paranoia was a spy's companion, but this felt real. He needed to get the cipher to headquarters, to someone who could crack it. But as he stepped out into the night, a single thought gnawed at him. Nightingale had never been sloppy. If this drop was a mistake or a trap, it meant the game had changed. And Erich was no longer sure who the players were. Back at his safe house, a cramped attic flat overlooking the spree, he spread the cipher on a table lit by a single bulb. The numbers stared back, defiant, unyielding. He lit a cigarette of his own, the smoke curling upward as he traced the lines with a pencil. Hours passed, the ashtray filling, the fog thickening outside. Then a pattern emerged, not in the numbers, but in their rhythm. A stutter, a repetition. It wasn't a full code, it was a fragment, a warning. He scribbled a tentative decryption, cross-referencing an old BND key he'd memorized months ago. Agent, compromised, Berlin. The words hit like a punch. A double agent. Someone inside the BND, or worse, among the handful of operatives running assets in the East. Erich's mind spun through names: his handler, Karl Ritter, the Dour analyst, Marta Braun, the smug American liaison, Jack Hensley. Any of them could be the leak. Or none of them. The The cipher didn't say who, only that betrayal was coming and soon. He crushed the cigarette into the ashtray, the ember hissing out. The safe house felt smaller, the walls closer. If Nightingale was right, the double agent knew about the drops, the codes, maybe even Eric himself. He needed answers, and he needed them before the Stasi, or worse, came knocking. Tomorrow, he'd meet Ritter at the usual spot, a cafe near the Tiergarten. But tonight, he'd sleep with the Walther under his pillow, the cipher locked in a hidden safe. In Berlin, trust was a currency no one could afford. Morning broke over Berlin with a reluctant gray light, the fog thinning just enough to reveal the skeletal trees of the Tiergarten. Eric Voss sat at a corner table in Café Linden, a small, smoky place where the coffee was bitter and the clientele kept to themselves. He wore a nondescript suit, his hat pulled low, blending into the crowd of early risers, workers, pensioners, a few bleary-eyed students. The cipher was tucked into a false lining in his briefcase. Its weight a constant reminder of the night's revelation. A double agent. The words looped in his mind. A refrain he couldn't shake. Karl Ritter arrived at exactly 9:15, as always. The older man moved with the stiff precision of a former Wehrmacht officer. His gray overcoat buttoned tight against the chill. He slid into the seat across from Eric without a word, signaling the waitress for a coffee. Ritter was Eric's handler, a veteran of the espionage game who'd cut his teeth running agents against the Soviets in the late 40s. His face was a map of creases, his eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. If anyone could be trusted, it was Ritter, or so Eric had always believed. "You look like hell," Ritter said, his voice a low growl as he lit a cigarette. "Late night. Something came up," Eric replied, keeping his tone neutral. He slid a folded newspaper across the table, a signal that he had something to pass. Ritter's hand brushed it casually, but his eyes flicked up, searching Eric's face. "Trouble?" Ritter asked, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Could be." Eric sipped his coffee, letting the silence stretch. He couldn't tell Ritter everything, not yet. If the double agent was in the BND, Ritter might be compromised, intentionally or not. Nightingale sent a package. Unusual. Ritter's brow furrowed. Unusual how? Numbers. A cipher, but not the standard fare. I started working it, got a fragment. It's bad news. Ritter leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. How bad? Bad enough that I'm not sure who to trust. Eric met his handler's gaze, watching for a flinch, a tell. Nothing. Ritter's face was stone, unreadable. Bring it in, Ritter said after a moment. We'll get the eggheads on it. If Nightingale's spooked, we need to know why. Eric nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. Bringing it in meant handing it over, losing control. If the double agent was in headquarters, the cipher could vanish. Or worse, be twisted to point the finger at him. He needed more time, more pieces of the puzzle. Tonight, he lied. I'll drop it at the usual spot. Ritter grunted, satisfied, and stood to leave. Watch your back, Voss. Berlin's getting uglier by the day. As Ritter disappeared into the crowd, Eric's eyes drifted to the window. A man lingered across the street, reading a newspaper, his posture too stiff to be casual. Fedora, broad shoulders, the same silhouette from the phone booth. Eric's stomach tightened. He was being watched, and not subtly. The Stasi? The Americans? Or someone closer? He paid for his coffee and slipped out a side exit, cutting through the Tiergarten's winding paths. The park was a maze of bare branches and mist, the perfect place to lose a tail or confront one. He slowed his pace, listening. Footsteps crunched faintly behind him, deliberate but distant. Eric ducked behind a tree, his hand on the Walther, and waited. The figure emerged from the fog, a man in his 30s, clean-shaven, with the hard-edged look of a professional. Not Stasi, too polished. CIA, maybe? He carried no weapon Eric could see, but his hands were in his pockets, a classic feint. Eric stepped out, gun low but ready. Who are you? Eric snapped, his German clipped and cold. The man stopped, raising his hands slowly. Easy, friend. Name's Hensley. Jack Hensley. I'm with the company. His accent was American, Midwest flatness with a hint of swagger. The BND's liaison. Eric had met him once, a cocky bastard who liked to throw his weight around. What do you want, Hensley? Same thing you do. Answers. Hensley smirked, but his eyes were wary. Word is, you've got something hot. Something Nightingale dug up. My people want in. Your people. Eric's grip tightened on the gun. This is BND business. Stay out of it. Hensley shrugged. Suit yourself. But if it's what I think it is, you're in over your head. That cipher's not just a warning, it's a death sentence. For Nightingale, maybe for you. Eric's blood ran cold. How did Hensley know about the cipher? He hadn't told Ritter its contents, only hinted. Either the American was guessing or someone else was talking. You're fishing, Eric said, stepping closer. Get lost, or I'll make you. Hensley chuckled, backing off. Have it your way, but when the Stasi come knocking, don't say I didn't warn you. He melted into the fog, leaving Eric alone with the rustling leaves and his racing thoughts. Back at the safe house, Eric pored over the cipher again. Hensley's words gnawed at him, a death sentence. He pushed deeper into the decryption, cross-referencing keys and patterns. By dusk, he had more. Agent, compromised Berlin operation. Falcon. Falcon, a code name he'd heard whispered in briefings. An upcoming extraction, a high-value asset in the East. If the double agent knew about Falcon, the operation was doomed. He needed Nightingale. The defector was his only link to the truth. But contacting an asset in East Berlin was a gamble. Checkpoint crossings were watched, dead drops compromised. He'd have to go himself, tonight under cover of darkness. The wall was a death trap, but Eric had crossed it before, through a tunnel near Friedrichstrasse known only to a few. Risky, but he had no choice. As he packed a bag, gun, flashlight, forged papers, a knock rattled the door. He froze, hand on the Walther. No one knew this safe house. No one but Ritter. Through the peephole, he saw Marta Braun, the analyst, her pale face framed by a scarf. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder. Eric, open up, she whispered. It's urgent. He hesitated, then unlatched the door. Marta slipped inside, breathless. Ritter sent me. He said you've got something big, and that you're not safe. Not safe from who? Eric asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Marta's eyes darted to the cipher on the table. From whoever's already sold us out. The tunnel smelled of damp earth and rot, its walls slick with condensation as Eric crawled through the narrow passage beneath the wall. The beam of his flashlight danced across wooden supports, some splintered and sagging, a reminder that this route, dug by desperate defectors years ago, could collapse at any moment. His knees ached, his coat snagged on jagged stones, but he pressed on. East Berlin was a lion's den, and Nightingale was his only hope of cracking the cipher's full meaning. Marta's warning echoed in his ears, whoever's already sold us out. If she was right, time was running out. He'd left her at the safe house, reluctantly trusting her to guard the cipher. Marta Braun was an enigma, brilliant with codes, quiet to a fault, her past a blank slate even to the BND's files. Ritter vouched for her, but Eric's instincts screamed caution. She claimed Ritter was digging into Nightingale's last transmissions, hunting for clues about the double agent. But why send her instead of coming himself? Eric shoved the thought aside as he reached the tunnel's end, a rusted grate opening into a storm drain beneath Friedrichstrasse. He emerged into the night, the East's silence oppressive. No chatter, no laughter, just the occasional bark of a guard dog or the clatter of a Stasi patrol. Eric adjusted his forged papers, identifying him as Hans Weber, a factory worker from Leipzig visiting relatives. The disguise was thin, but it would hold under a cursory glance. Nightingale's last known location was a tenement near Alexanderplatz, a warren of crumbling flats where the defector hid among the downtrodden. Eric moved quickly, sticking to shadows, the Walther a cold comfort against his chest. The tenement loomed ahead, its facade pocked with bullet scars from the war. Eric climbed the stairs to the third floor, the air thick with coal smoke and despair. Apartment 3C. He knocked twice. Paused, then once more, the signal. No answer. He tried the knob, it turned. Inside, the room was a shambles, overturned chair, papers scattered, a single bulb swaying from the ceiling. Nightingale was gone. Eric's gut twisted. He scanned the chaos, spotting a smear of blood on the floorboards, still wet. A struggle recent. The Stasi? Or someone else? He rifled through the papers, receipts, maps, nothing useful until his fingers brushed a scrap tucked under the table. Numbers again, scrawled in Nightingale's shaky hand, 9-14-22-5-19-20. Another cipher fragment. He pocketed it, his mind racing. If Nightingale had been taken, the double agent might already have what they needed to bury Falcon and Eric. A creak from the hallway snapped him alert. He drew the Walther, easing toward the door. Through the crack, he saw a figure short, wiry, a woman in a drab coat. She carried a broom, her movements too deliberate for a janitor. Eric flung the door open, gun trained. She yelped, dropping the broom, hands flying up. "Don't shoot," she stammered in German, her accent thick with fear. "I'm just cleaning." "Who sent you?" Eric demanded, stepping closer. "No one. I lived downstairs," heard a noise, her eyes darted to the bloodstain, widening. She knew more than she let on. "Tell me what happened here," Eric said, lowering the gun slightly. "Now." She swallowed hard. "Men came. 2 of them an hour ago. Dark coats, hats. They dragged him out, your friend." He was shouting something about a bird. Then they were gone. A bird? Nightingale? Eric's jaw tightened. "Which way?" "Toward the river. The spree." She hesitated. "They weren't Stasi. No uniforms. Foreign, maybe?" "Foreign." Hensley's smug face flashed in his mind. The CIA had assets everywhere, even here. But why take Nightingale? To silence him or to use him? Eric shoved the woman aside and bolted down the stairs, the new cipher fragment burning in his pocket. The spree was a kilometer away, a dark ribbon cutting through the city. If Nightingale was alive, that's where he'd be. The streets were a labyrinth, each corner a potential ambush. Eric moved fast, ducking into alleys as headlights swept past. Near the river, he spotted a warehouse, its windows blacked out, a faint glow seeping from the cracks. Voices murmured inside, English, not German. He crept closer, peering through a gap. 2 men stood over a figure slumped in a chair, wrists bound. "Nightingale?" His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, but he was alive. "Talk, damn it," one of the men snapped, his accent American. "Where's the rest of it?" Nightingale mumbled something incoherent, blood dripping from his lip. The second man, a hulking brute, raised a fist, but the first stopped him. "Not yet. He's got to crack eventually." Eric's mind raced. The Americans had Nightingale, but they didn't have the cipher, or not all of it. The fragment in his pocket might be the key. He needed to get Nightingale out, but 2 against 1 in a confined space was suicide. He scanned the warehouse, a side door, unguarded, a stack of crates nearby. A diversion might work. He slipped around back, prying loose a brick from the wall. With a flick of his wrist, he hurled it through a window on the far side. Glass shattered, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The men inside cursed, one darting toward the noise, the other staying with Nightingale. Eric seized the moment, kicking in the side door and firing a single shot. The guard dropped, clutching his leg, and Eric lunged for Nightingale, cutting his bonds with a knife. "Move!" Eric hissed, hauling the defector up. Nightingale stumbled, dazed but compliant. They burst into the night, the second American shouting behind them. Bullets pinged off the warehouse wall as they ran, the river's edge their only cover. At the bank, Nightingale gasped, "The cipher, it's Falcon, they know, who knows?" Eric demanded, pulling him into the shadows. "Someone inside." "Not Stasi. One of ours." Nightingale's voice broke. "They're selling us out." Eric's heart sank. "One of ours. BND or CIA, it didn't matter. The double agent was real and they were closing in. He had Nightingale, but the enemy had the advantage. The spree glittered darkly ahead, a border within a border. They needed to get back west, fast. The spree lapped at the muddy bank, its waters black and uninviting under the East Berlin sky. Eric Voss crouched beside Nightingale, the defectors ragged, breathing loud in the stillness. The warehouse was 100 meters behind them, its shouts and gunfire fading into the night, but safety was still a world away. The tunnel back to the west was their only shot, and every second they lingered risked discovery. Nightingale clutched Eric's arm, his swollen face a mask of pain and urgency. "They know about Falcon," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "The extraction, it's tomorrow. If they get the rest of the cipher, it's over." Eric's mind churned. Operation Falcon was a whisper in the BND's corridors, a plan to smuggle a high-ranking Soviet scientist out of East Berlin, a man with secrets that could tip the Cold War's balance. If the double agent had sold it out, the scientist was as good as dead, and so were they. "Who's they?" Eric pressed, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Stasi? CIA?" Nightingale shook his head, wincing. "Not Stasi. Someone inside BND or your American friends. I don't know the name. The cipher, it's got proof. Dates, meetings? I only sent you part of it." The fragment Eric had found in the tenement burned in his pocket, its numbers a taunting riddle. He needed the rest, but Nightingale's capture meant it was likely gone, taken by the men in the warehouse. "Where's the original?" Eric asked, pulling the defector to his feet. "Hidden. My flat, under the floorboards. But they'll have searched it by now." Nightingale stumbled, clutching his ribs. "We've got to move." Eric nodded, guiding him along the riverbank toward the storm drain. The fog had thickened again, a blessing that cloaked their retreat. His mind raced through the night's chaos. Marta's warning, Hensley's ambush, the Americans beating answers out of Nightingale. Too many players, too many lies. If the traitor was BND, Ritter and Marta were suspects. If CIA, Hensley's smug grin fit the bill. But Nightingale's words, "one of ours," suggested a deeper rot, a betrayal from within Eric's own circle. They reached the drain, its grate a rusted skeleton against the concrete. Eric pried it open, the screech of metal making him wince. "Go!" he urged, shoving Nightingale inside. The defector crawled, slow and pained, as Eric followed, pulling the grate shut behind them. The tunnel was tighter than he remembered, the air stale and heavy. His flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls. Halfway through, Nightingale stopped, gasping. "Wait, I heard something." Eric killed the light, listening. A faint scrape echoed from the east end. Footsteps, deliberate and closing. Someone had found the drain. He drew the Walther, his pulse hammering. "Keep moving," he whispered, nudging Nightingale forward. They scrambled, the tunnel narrowing until Eric's shoulders brushed the sides. The footsteps grew louder, a splash of water signaling pursuit. At the west end, Eric kicked out the exit grate, tumbling into a ditch near Friedrichstrasse western edge. He hauled Nightingale up, the defector's legs buckling. Headlights flared in the distance, border guards, alerted by the noise. Eric dragged Nightingale into an alley, his gun ready, but the pursuer didn't emerge. Whoever it was had stopped, perhaps wary of crossing into the west. For now, they were clear. The safe house was a risk, but Nightingale needed rest and Eric needed answers. They staggered through backstreets, reaching the attic flat as dawn bled gray into the sky. Marta was gone, the cipher still on the table where he'd left it, a note pinned beneath. Ritter called. "He's worried. Meet at noon, Tiergarten." Eric's stomach knotted. Marta's absence felt wrong, her note too convenient. He settled Nightingale on the cot, fetching water and a rag for his wounds. "Talk," Eric said, handing him the glass. "Everything you know." Nightingale sipped, wincing. "The cipher's from a leak, a Stasi officer I turned months ago. He got wind of a mole feeding intel back to Moscow, someone with access to BND ops. Falcon was the target, times, routes, safe houses. I encoded it, split it into pieces. You got the first. The second was at my flat. And the third?" Eric asked, holding up the tenement fragment. Nightingale's eyes widened. "You found it. Good. The third's still out there, a dead drop near the wall by the old church. If they haven't got it yet, it names the traitor." Eric paced, piecing it together. 3 fragments, a warning, a target, a name. He had 2, but the third was a gamble back across the wall, under the Stasi's nose. He glanced at the clock, 10 a.m. 2 hours until Ritter's meeting. "Rest," he told Nightingale. "I'll get it." "No," Nightingale croaked. "They'll kill you. Send someone else, your handler." "Ritter's not here," Eric snapped, frustration boiling over. "And I don't know who to trust." Nightingale slumped, defeated. "Then we're dead already." Eric ignored him, checking the cipher again. The new fragment, September 14th, 22 to May 19th, 20, clicked with a key he'd used before. Invest, a partial word, but it hinted at investigation, a probe into the mole. He needed the third piece to be sure. The church drop was near Checkpoint Charlie, a hotspot crawling with guards. He'd go alone, armed, disguised as a laborer. Risky, but stalling wasn't an option. He left Nightingale with the Walther spare clip and slipped out, the fog his shield. The Tiergarten meeting loomed, but the drop came first. At the wall, he blended into a work crew repairing a barricade, his forged papers passing muster. The church was a ruin, its steeple a broken finger against the sky. The drop, a loose brick near the altar, yielded a tin box. Inside, a final scrap, 3-15-13-16-1-14. Footsteps crunched outside. Eric pocketed the cipher and drew his knife, peering through a shattered window. Hensley stood there, alone, a pistol in hand. "Vas," he called, his voice cutting through the fog. "We need to talk." The ruined church was a crypt of shadows, its broken pews and shattered stained glass swallowed by the fog. Eric Voss crouched behind the altar, the final cipher fragment clutched in one hand, his knife in the other. Jack Hensley's voice rang out again, sharp and insistent, cutting through the damp air. "Voss, I know you're in there. Come out or I start shooting." Eric's mind raced. Hensley alone was suspicious. The American never worked without backup unless he had an angle. The cipher's numbers, 3-15-13-16-1-14. Burned in his pocket, a name waiting to be unlocked. Was it Hensley's? The CIA man had tracked him too easily, knew too much about Nightingale and Falcon. But if he was the double agent, why confront Eric now in the open? A trap, maybe, or a desperate play. Eric edged toward a side window, peering out. Hensley stood in the churchyard, pistol raised, his fedora tilted against the mist. No Stasi, no shadows lurking, just him. Eric weighed his options. Fight, flee, or talk. The drop was his, but Hensley's presence meant the wall was compromised. He needed answers more than a shootout. "All right?" Eric called, stepping into the doorway, knife low but ready. "Talk." Hensley smirked, lowering his gun slightly. "Smart move. You've got the last piece, don't you? Nightingale's little treasure." "How'd you find me?" Eric asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Been tailing you since the river." "You're good, Voss, but not invisible. My boys lost Nightingale, but I figured you'd go for the drop. You're predictable that way." Eric's grip tightened. "What do you want with it?" "Same as you. To stop the leak. Falcon's tomorrow, scientist named Volkov knows missile codes. If the mole gets him, Moscow wins. I'm not here to screw you, Voss. I'm here to help." "Help?" Eric scoffed. "You grabbed Nightingale, beat him bloody. That's your help." Hensley's smirk faded. "That wasn't me. My team found him after someone else got rough, Stasi, maybe, or your traitor. We were trying to squeeze him for the cipher before they came back. You beat us to it." Eric didn't buy it. Hensley's story was too neat, too rehearsed. But the clock was ticking, a Ritter's meeting was an hour away, and Nightingale was alone at the safe house. "Prove it," Eric said. "Give me a name. Who's the mole?" Hensley hesitated, then holstered his gun. "I don't know. That's why I need the cipher. My intel says it's someone high, BND, or CIA. You've got the key, Voss. Crack it and we both win." Eric studied him, searching for the lie. Hensley's eyes were hard but steady. If he was the traitor, he'd have shot already. "Back off," Eric said, stepping out. "I'll decode it myself. If you're clean, you'll get the name when I do." Hensley nodded, reluctant. "Fair enough. But watch your back. Whoever's behind this knows you're close." Eric turned, slipping into the fog, the cipher a weight against his chest. He crossed back through the work crew, heart pounding as a guard glanced his way but waved him on. The safe house was a half-hour trek, and he used every trick, doubling back, cutting through alleys, to shake any tail. When he arrived, Nightingale was awake, pale but alert, the Walther in his lap. "You got it?" Nightingale asked, voice hoarse. Eric nodded, spreading the 3 fragments on the table. "Let's finish this." He pulled out his notebook, the old B&D key humming in his memory. The first fragment, Agent Compromised, Berlin. The second, Investigation, Falcon. The third, March 15th, 13 to January 16th, 14, clicked into place with a simple shift, company combined, it read. Agent Compromised, Berlin. Investigation, Falcon Company. Company, Eric muttered. CIA? Nightingale frowned. Or a codename. It's vague, too vague. My source said the mole's name was in there. Eric reworked it, cross-referencing dates from Nightingale's intel. The numbers shifted again, a double-layer code, Ritter. His handler's name stared back, stark and damning. Eric's breath caught. Carl Ritter, his mentor, the man who'd pulled him into the B&D. It couldn't be. Ritter. Nightingale echoed, incredulous. You're Ritter. He's meeting me soon, Eric said, voice flat. Tiergarten, noon. If it's him, he'll want the cipher and me out of the way. Nightingale gripped the gun. Then it's a trap. You can't go. I have to, Eric countered. If he's the mole, I need proof. If he's not, I need him to stop Falcon from collapsing. He checked his watch, 11:30. No time to waste. He armed himself, Walther loaded, knife sheathed, and left Nightingale with instructions to flee if he didn't return by dusk. The Tiergarten was a short walk, its paths quiet under the midday gloom. Eric spotted Ritter by the pond, smoking as usual, his gray coat a beacon in the mist. No Marta, no backup. Just him. Voss Ritter greeted, exhaling smoke. You're late. Had to deter, Eric said, hand near his gun. Got the cipher sorted. It's ugly. Ritter's eyes narrowed. Show me. Eric hesitated, then handed over a decoy, a fake fragment he'd scribbled en route. Ritter scanned it, his face unreadable. This says Hensley's the leak. You sure? Positive, Eric lied, watching him. Ritter's jaw tightened, a flicker of something, anger? Relief crossing his features. Good work, Ritter said, pocketing the paper. We'll move on him tonight. Falcon's still on Volkov's crossing at dawn. Meet me at headquarters, 8 p.m. Eric nodded, but his gut screamed. Ritter's calm was too perfect, his acceptance too quick. As the older man walked off, Eric tailed him from a distance, blending into the crowd. Ritter didn't head for headquarters, he veered east, toward a phone booth near the wall. Eric watched him dial, speaking low, then hang up and vanish into the fog. The truth hit like a bullet, Ritter was the mole. But why? And who was he calling? Eric had the cipher, the name, but no proof beyond numbers on paper. Falcon hung in the balance, and the safe house might already be compromised. He needed to act now. The fog thickened as Eric Voss trailed Ritter through Berlin's labyrinthine streets, the older man's gray coat a ghostly blur. The phone booth call gnawed at him. Ritter hadn't reported to headquarters. He'd contacted someone else, someone on the other side. The cipher's accusation, Ritter, was no mistake. Eric's handler, the man who'd taught him the game, was the double agent selling Falcon to the Soviets for reasons Eric couldn't yet fathom. Proof was still a shadow, but time was a luxury he didn't have. Dawn loomed, and with it, Volkov's extraction. Eric returned to the safe house, mind racing. Nightingale sat by the window, Walther in hand, his bruised face taut with dread. Well? The defector asked. It's Ritter, Eric said, voice clipped. He's the mole. Took a fake cipher I fed him, claimed it named Hensley. Then he made a call eastbound. Nightingale cursed softly. He's covering his tracks. If he's got the Stasi or KGB waiting, Falcon's dead. And us with it, Eric added. He spread the cipher fragments on the table, triple-checking the decryption. Agent compromised, Berlin investigation, Falcon Company Ritter. The company threw him, CIA or a red herring. But Ritter's name was the anchor. We need evidence. Something solid before I take him down. Nightingale pointed to the third fragment. My source said he met the mole, dates, places. If Ritter's movements match, that's your proof. Eric dug into BND logs he'd memorized, Ritter's trips, absences. A meeting in Leipzig, October 10th, aligned with the cipher's timeline. Another in Potsdam, November 1st. Too precise for coincidence. He's been crossing the wall, Eric muttered, feeding them everything. A knock rattled the door. Eric drew his gun, motioning Nightingale to the corner. Through the peephole, Marta Braun stood, scarf tight around her pale face. Eric, it's me, she called, voice urgent. Ritter's gone dark. Headquarters lost him. Eric opened the door, gun trained. Where've you been? Tracking him, Marta said, stepping in. After you left, I checked his office. Files on Falcon routes times were missing. Then he vanished. I think he knows you're onto him. Eric lowered the Walther, but suspicion lingered. Why'd you come here? Because you're the only one I trust. Her eyes flicked to Nightingale, then the cipher. Is that it? The proof? He nodded, handing her the fragments. Marta scanned them, her analyst's mind clicking. Ritter, my God. He's been at it for months, small leaks, testing the water. Falcon's his big play. To who? Eric pressed. KGB. Likely, Marta said. Or a middleman. He's meeting someone tonight. I traced his call to a warehouse by the Spree East Side. 10 p.m. Eric checked his watch, 8:45. Then we hit him there. Stop the handover, save Falcon. He turned to Nightingale. You're staying. You've done enough. No, Nightingale said, standing shakily. I started this. I finish it. Marta armed herself with a spare pistol and the trio slipped into the night. The tunnel crossing was tense, silent, the fog their shield as they emerged near the Spree. The warehouse matched Hensley's from the night before, ironic or deliberate. Eric led, creeping to a window. Inside, Ritter stood with two men, dark suits, Soviet accents. A briefcase changed hands, Ritter's voice low, Volkov's route, Dawn, Friedrichstrasse. You'll have him. Eric signaled Marta and Nightingale. They burst in, guns blazing. One Soviet dropped, the other dove for cover. Ritter spun, shock flashing across his face, then drew a Luger. "Was, you idiot, why?" Eric shouted, firing a warning shot that grazed Ritter's arm. "Why sell us out?" Ritter grimaced, clutching the wound. "You wouldn't understand. The wall's a lie, both sides are rotten. Moscow pays better, and I'm tired of losing." The second Soviet lunged, but Nightingale's shot took him down. Ritter bolted for the door, briefcase in hand. Eric tackled him, slamming him against the wall. The case spilled open, maps, timetables, Falcon's blueprint. Proof undeniable. "You're done," Eric snarled, cuffing Ritter with a rope from the floor. Marta grabbed the documents, her face grim. "Volkov's still in play. We can reroute him." They dragged Ritter back west, the tunnel a slog with his dead weight. At headquarters, Eric handed him over, the cipher and files sealing the case. Ritter's glare burned, but he said nothing. Hensley appeared, late and smug, claiming credit for flushing the rat. Eric let him, Falcon mattered more. Dawn broke as Volkov crossed, rerouted to a quiet sector near Tempelhof. The scientist was gaunt, terrified, but alive, his missile codes intact. Nightingale vanished into witness protection, his debt paid. Marta stayed on, her quiet resolve unshaken. Eric watched the wall from a distance, Ritter's betrayal a scar he'd carry. Back at the safe house, he burned the cipher fragments, the ashes drifting into the fog. Berlin remained a chessboard, its players shifting, but for now, the game was his. The double agent was unmasked, Falcon secured. Yet as the city woke, Eric knew another cipher, another betrayal was always waiting.